Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, baby metal fan. And I'm going to talk today about a song that, to be honest, I hadn't really intended to talk about. Believing, a song off The Other One, which came out earlier this year. And I hadn't intended to talk about it because it's entirely in English, which is unusual for baby metal. There are not many that are exclusively in English. And so I thought, well, that's pretty self-evident. It's not worth discussing. A friend and fellow fan of the band recently asked me if I was going to talk about it, and I thought, well, I'll take a quick look. And of course, baby metal being baby metal, the song is nowhere near as straightforward as I thought it was, even though the lines of the songs individually are perfectly clear. And this, I think, is actually really interesting in and of itself. Often when I'm talking about the Japanese lyrics of baby metal, and I'm sort of trying to put things together and talking about a kind of built-in ambiguity, sometimes that's about the invisibility of pronouns, but often it's just trying to piece these different images together in ways that construct a coherent whole. And a couple of times people have said, well, you know, if it's that hard to understand, maybe you're not understanding the Japanese right, which is always possible, of course. But I talk to a lot of people whose Japanese is better than mine, and I think that this is a pattern. And I think that a song like Believing is a great example of that pattern, where each utterance, each line of the song is absolutely clear. But what it all adds up to is far from clear. And I think we can look at this in a couple of different ways. One is to say this is a very postmodern approach to songwriting, where what we're getting is not overall coherence, it's not narrative, it's not a thesis-driven idea being presented to us. What we're getting is fragments. We're not getting an overall picture, we're getting a collage. And if you look at a collage closely, every little piece of the collage is distinct and clear, but the way that it forms a unified whole is far from clear. It can have a larger aesthetic impression, an effect, but how the individual parts relate to each other is sometimes not clear at all. Sometimes they don't seem to relate to each other except to present color or texture or whatever. So that's one way of thinking about it, that the song is not actually coherent. Another way to think of it, of course, this being baby metal, is to say, well, there are lots of different possible readings in play, and you are being invited as a member of the audience, as a member of The One, which is both the band and the fan base, as I've said many times before, you are expected to complete your sense of what the song means for you and embrace that. So I thought that I would do a quick walkthrough of the song, not breaking it down sentence by sentence as I normally would because the English is clear, and then talk about some possible ways to read the song on the assumption that there is an overall coherence, that it does finally mean something or some things, and we can then choose which one we find most compelling. Instrumentally, the song managed to do something which is really classic baby metal. It gives you those clanging, hard, guttural guitars, and then it gives you really clean, melodic soloing over the top, right? These clear, crisp musical phrases. It gives us a very kind of prog rock, playful approach to rhythm, the sort of stop-start sounds, the quick adjustments, the shifting of how many beats there are in the bar. That's very progressive. But it also supports a song which is very ethereal and melodic in classic baby metal tradition. So we get that sort of dark pounding stuff, but then at the same time we get a chorus which is really quite beautiful and in its phrasing. Let's talk about the lyric first, simply in a vacuum, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the stuff that came out when the song was first announced that we might want to include in our overall assessment of what the song finally means. I don't want to be confused anymore. There's no safe space. We just can't go back to the way we were, leave everything in God's hands. Okay, so we begin in a moment of frustration and confusion, a sense that nothing is safe, but also a sense that we can't simply return to a situation before this became our current predicament. And then that slightly odd fourth line, leave everything in God's hands. This is not a particularly baby metal sensibility if we're taking God in a strict religious sense. I'm going to come back to that in a second. The seasons change, you're not the same. The seasons change, we're not the same. Don't go back. All the things you said, all the things I know, all the things you said, all the things I know. Believing you, believing you. Now, so there are a couple of things that happen as the song progresses. And one of them is that there are a number of things that sound almost exactly the same that get repeated, but they're repeated with modification in ways that change what they mean. The first thing to say, of course, is the song is called Believing. And when I first heard it before I read the official lyric, I assumed it meant believe in you. But it doesn't actually say that. It says believing you. And believing you is not the same thing as believe in you or believing in you, right? If I believe you, that means I think you're telling the truth. If I believe in you, it means I am making a leap of faith about your capacity or your ability to do something or to complete something. So there's something I'm putting faith in. That's a different thing entirely. One is about truth-telling. The other is about character. And those things might be related, but their grammatical function is quite different. So I think, I've seen a number of people responding to this song, and one of the things that people obviously want to do is read that line and the title of the song as meaning believing in somebody, even if that somebody turns out to be yourself. But it's not actually what the song says, right? It says believing you, in other words, trusting that you are speaking the truth, which is not a vote of confidence in your capacity. That's different. Now, as I said, these lines get repeated in different ways. Don't go back. And then all the things you said, all the things I know. Remember that because it's going to change next time. But first we establish this driving theme, which in some ways I think is the clearest and the easiest to connect to. The seasons change, you're not the same. The seasons change, we're not the same. Time passes, everything alters, and we alter. In the process, we are the sum of our experiences. We, by definition, change as time passes. don't go back. We've already said in the first stanza, we can't go back to the way things were, right? And so now we're saying, don't try. You can't reset the clock. You can't return to whatever was the situation before the predicament that we're in. And then all the things you said, all the things I know. Now, as I said, if we're talking about belief in somebody speaking the truth, then this question of things that people say is important, right? You said things. Now, we don't know who the speaker is, and we don't know who the you addressed is yet. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But let's just clarify the relationship. You said things. I know things. Maybe there's a disconnect between those two things. Maybe you said things that weren't true. Maybe I know things that you don't. But I think it's part of this sense of a tension between these, for the moment, two people, right? And then believing you. And again, that's another one of those repetitions with variation, right? On the page, it just says believing you. But when you hear it, we shift the metrical emphasis to change where the important part of the words are. Believing you. In the second articulation of the word believing, it's actually the third, believing you. In the third articulation of believing, we turn it into a two-syllable word. It goes from believing to believing in order to emphasize you. So there's a shift even within the line. The emphasis starts off on being about belief, and it finishes up being about the person being believed. So that's a change. I don't want to be afraid anymore. There's no middle ground. We just can't go back to the way we were. It's kind of like heads or tails. What? This is what I mean about how every line is perfectly clear, but the way they sit next to each other makes you think that you're missing some kind of connective tissue to make the whole thing make sense. This is a restatement of what was said in the first stanza, again, with variation. Before, I don't want to be confused anymore. Now I'm saying, a little more honestly, I don't want to be afraid anymore. Before we said there was no safe space. Now we're saying there's no middle ground. We can't go back to the way we were. Same line. It's kind of like heads or tails. Now, heads or tails, obviously we're talking about flipping a coin. There's no middle ground, so we've got a binary choice, heads or tails, right? That seems to be the suggestion. So we're presented with two choices, but I'm not clear what those two choices are. Now, in terms of the relationship of this stanza to the previous stanza, that stanza ended with leave everything in God's hands. What's the connection between leaving things in God's hands and it's kind of like heads or tails? Well, it could be that what we're saying in both stanzas is we have no control. And to try and have that control is an illusion. So we leave everything in God's hands, turn things over to the universe. And it's like flipping a coin. Right? There's going to be some sort of outcome of that, but it's not one that we can control. So maybe that's the thing. I don't know what the two choices are if we're saying that that's what it is, that it's heads or tails in terms of what we do next. Maybe you could say it's a question of either going back or going forward, given some of the other lyrics of the song. But I think the emphasis is on not being in control and accepting that, which is in some ways very Zen, right? We're not looking for divine intervention. And I think that the use of the term God in the first stanza sounds differently to non-Japanese people than it does to Japanese people. That it doesn't quite mean the same thing. And it doesn't imply religious conviction necessarily. And it doesn't imply belief. The belief, unless we say we're talking to God, and I don't think that we are, then the belief is not about believing in God or some sort of spiritual presence. It's believing in whoever we're talking to. Come back to the chorus, the season change, you are not the same, season change, we are not the same. Then a little modification. We went from don't go back to don't let go, which is not the same thing, right? Before we were saying you can't go back. And so now we're saying if we accept that, if this is a progression, right? Bear with me. If this is a progression of ideas through the course of the song, then we say don't go back because you can't. But also, don't let go. Don't let go of the past or of the present. It's possible to do both, right? It's possible to hold on to things, including things from the past, without trying to recreate them. Sometimes the past is an anchor to who we are. Maybe that's what we're not letting go of. Or we're not letting go of each other. All the things I said, all the things you know, all the things I said, all the things you know. So we've switched it around. Before we said all the things you said, all the things I know. Now we're saying all the things I said, all the things you know. So this is the sort of he said, she said, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. The second stanza and chorus suggest that if we were first saying there's a problem with the other person and the things that you said, now we're saying I'm in the same boat. I also have said things that might not go along with what you know. So there's a kind of acceptance there of some responsibility for this disconnect. Believing you. Again, we're accepting, we seem to be making a decision to solve whatever the problem is by committing to a belief in what the other person is saying or has said. And maybe that's also a belief in them in more general terms. But again, I think that's slightly different. Then we get this middle eight, which is about as nebulous and opaque as we can get. Wherever you are, wherever we are, wherever you are, wherever we are. Okay. The one thing I would emphasize is the present tense verb, right? It's about where we are, not where we were. So if we're talking about temporality, the changing of the seasons, things that have happened in the past, now we're asserting something, some kind of connection, regardless of place, and I would say anchored in the present. suggesting an ongoing connection or a desire to keep hold of that ongoing connection between the speaker and the person addressed, wherever they are.
The seasons change, you're not the same. The seasons change, we are not the same. Don't forget all the things I say, all the things I know, all the things I say, all the things you know. Believe in you.
Final chorus. The seasons change, you're not the same. The seasons change, we are not the same. Final modification. Don't forget, right? So we went from don't go back, don't let go. Now we get don't forget. And that's why I think the don't let go might be about not trying to recreate the past, but also not letting it go. Because now we're invoking memory as somehow important. Don't forget whatever was there, right? Because it has value even though we're not in that place anymore. All the things I said, all the things I know, all the things you said, all the things you know. Now before, the things that you said and the things that I know, the things that I said and the things that you know seemed to be imbalanced or in opposition. Now they're being lined up evenly. We've both said things. We both know things. And this, I would suggest, is the platform from which we build our future. Believing you, believing you. Now, this is all very open-ended and very vague, and it could be that in trying to sort of position it in terms of a relationship, one person speaking to another person, I'm making it overly specific. But let's just run with that for a second. So one possible reading would be to simply say that this is the speaker of the song talking to somebody else. Friends, lovers, people who were close, but have been somehow separated, have grown apart, and are divided somehow by an inability to believe each other. The speaker resolves to leave the past in the past while holding on to memories and takes a chance on the future by believing the other person going forward. So that's one way to look at it, right? To say we've had issues, we've grown separately, there have been some sort of problems about truth-telling, right? It has to come down to that, I think. But moving forward, I'm committing to my belief in what you say. I trust you. And we move forward, bringing with us a sense of the past, but not being defined by it. So that's the relationship reading. Let's talk about some other possibilities. Of course, baby metal being baby metal, some fans will always read every baby metal song as being about baby metal. So some people have said, oh, it's a song about Yui, about moving on without her. Except, that the lyric doesn't really say that. And I get really tired of the argument that everything is somehow about Yui. To quote the song, don't go back. You cannot forget, but you got to move on, right? But I do think that there is something here about the band themselves. Let me say first, here's why I don't particularly like the idea that the song is somehow about the band. Because even as a fan, I don't care about that. That doesn't speak to me. It doesn't speak to my life. If the song is exclusively, and this goes for any autobiographical song that a band of any kind produces, if the song is exclusively about them, and I can't clearly relate to that, I'm not all that interested in it. The other thing that I dislike about these kind of readings is that they presuppose that the core meaning of a song requires you to already have information about the band and be invested in it. And that seems to me, if it's right, bad songwriting. If all you're thinking about, all you're singing about, all you're writing about is yourself, and other people who hear the song have to be invested in those things and have to know about them in advance of hearing the song, then there's something missing from the song, and ultimately anybody who hears it, the majority of people who hear it, are not going to interpret it in the way you want them to. So to me, this seems like a bit of a dead end. Now, I will say, if we're trying to be specific to the moment in which this song was written, we might talk about the pandemic, right? We might talk about, this sense of that nothing's safe and we can't go back to the way we were. The band are on hiatus through this period, and now they're trying to sort of energize and move forward. But how do you do that? You can't go back to what was, partly because the band is different now, but also because I think a lot of us have felt, since the pandemic, that reality didn't simply reset the way it was. The world is different now because of all that isolation, because of all that emphasis on the virtual and so on. Things have changed and we can't go back to it. So maybe there's something about that. Maybe there's something about trying to figure out how you move forward as artists in a world that has changed. I don't think the you can be Yui. That doesn't make sense to me. I wondered if it could mean the audience, but then I don't understand what the believing part is, because again, it's not simply believing in the audience. It's believing the audience, believing what the audience says. And I don't know what the audience is saying. That doesn't work for me. And even if it could be made to work, I suspect it's not going to be something that I find compelling or interesting. So let's push it now. I want to give two possible further readings. One is a sort of general existential reading, and the other is a slightly more specific version of that. So the existential reading is to talk about the self as somehow divided, as other, so that the I and the you of the song are actually the same. Okay, now this might sound a little weird, but now I want to bring in, when the song was first teased, it was presented as the inverted mirror reflection, Sakasa Utsushie. And the question attached to it was, I see myself in the mirror, but who am I actually? Kaga mini utsuru jibun ga mieru. Daga jibun to wa hontou ha dare na no ka. If I'm looking at myself in the mirror, I see myself, but I'm not sure that what I'm looking at is myself. And the phrase that came out to announce the song was Kisetsu ga kawate mo, ji ga nagarete mo, kawaranai mono to kawari yuku mono, kagami ni hansha suru hikari ga tarashi dasu, nitsu no kao, nitsu no so taisuru sakai, dareka no kotoba, onore no kotoba, shinjiru no wa. Even if the seasons change and time passes, some things remain the same and some things change. When light reflects in the mirror, what appears are two faces and two relative worlds. Who should we believe? Someone else's words or your own? I don't know that this idea of the mirror and the self clearly and easily maps onto the song as it subsequently came out in terms of everything that we've just been talking about. The seasons changed, the sense of conversation between two people and belief and so on. And I was like, okay, so without the mirror image stuff that came out, framing the song but not expressly part of the song, I don't know that this completely works. But if we roll with it and say, okay, so we're going to include that mirror image stuff as being a part of the song, and you can see this image of the teaser image, which includes the reflected foxes and the inversion there on one side. And then this becomes a conversation with the self. Now, when I was watching the video, the performance video, I think you see a number of moments in which there's an image of the hand held in front of the face. And that's partly a masking, a screening out so that you can't see. It's also potentially looking into a mirror, right? So it suggests two things. It suggests that the self is somehow potentially not visible to the outside. It's also suggesting potentially that I'm looking at a version of myself. So what does this self mean if we're talking in terms of mirror images and so on? Well, I think the obvious way, the simplest way, is to look at it as somehow that one is outer and public and the other is inner and private. But both are us, right? That we are both public individuals and private individuals, that we have a version of who we are in our own heads, and we have the version that everybody else sees, the thing that they judge, the thing that they deal with in daily interaction based on what they see and what you say. The version of the private self which gets verbalized and communicated to other people. And I think, the image of the fox there is kind of a neat one because it could be indicative of both inner or outer. For BABYMETAL, right, the associations with the fox as part of their public persona, the kitsune persona, but also that sense of the fox as the sort of private, interior, animal self, so it could go either way. The angst of the song comes as we move toward the recognition that both internal and external are, whether we like it or not, aspects of who we are. Each one informing the other and informing other people about who and what we are in order to make a coherent whole. And that's not something that we can stop. We're always going to be assessed, evaluated, loved, feared, hated, based on this sort of odd combination of inner and outer self. And that what other people think we are is going to be very different from the way that we think about ourselves. So that's the existential reading. And all in this reading, I think the core idea is the same, that we look at ourselves and we make the decision to believe ourselves and to accept that we are in a state of change, in a state of flux. And that sometimes the inner version of ourself struggles to maintain connection to the outer version of ourself because people make assumptions about us, often based on prior interactions, right? That they think they know who we are. And then when you evolve, you change, people are sometimes thrown by that, confused by it, resistant to it. So if this is a song in which the I and the you are actually the same person, that I'm looking in a mirror and I'm having this conversation with myself, trying to get to grips with the way in which I am evolving as a person, and that my inner and outer selves are somehow different. And I'm holding on to a version of the past or keeping it in mind without being defined by it. And that affects both inner and outer self. So that's the existential reading. The last version is a slightly modified version of that, which we'll call the digital reading. Now, and I would say it goes along with the existential reading, but it also goes along with the master concept of the other one, the album, positioning the song as a moment of specifically digital crisis in which we exist as real and digital forms of ourselves. The contemporary world is one where we live as much virtually as we do in flesh and blood reality, creating an uncertainty as to who we really are, since our online self is different from our true self. So this is, as I say, a digitally specific version of the inner and outer selves that we already discussed. The outer self is the front-facing social media version of ourselves, say. And the private inner version is something that doesn't manifest in that dimension. I think the song, if we look at it in those terms, is reminiscent of the kind of computer world evoked by Bring Me the Horizon's collaboration with BABYMETAL, Kingslayer, which also evokes this idea of living in a kind of digital space. And I think that this reading fits with elements of the song which I haven't talked about, which go beyond the lyrics. For example, you notice a lot of the time this sort of pixelated binary graphics that are flicking around the stage. And I think the digitized effects on the vocal, first time that we hear Sue's voice, it's clearly been tweaked, auto-tuned in some way. And I think that when they do that, it's deliberate. It suggests a kind of digital self. There's also a kind of an abrupt staccato vocal style in this song, where the lines get broken up into little pieces, right? Very sharp, hard. It's very robotic. And I think that that's also reflected in the temporal abrupt shifts that we hear in the instruments, right? I said at the beginning that this is a sort of prog rock technique, a strategy. And that's true. But I think, when you decide to use it, it's got to mean something. It's got to suggest something. It's got to feel like something. And in this case, I think it emphasizes this slightly digitized, robotic, non-human switch, right? There's no gradual movement. It's a hard, abrupt change. I think with all these readings, including this last one, the through line is still temporal. We can't return to the past, but that doesn't mean that we should let it go. So we remember and we move on, accepting that, like the seasons, all things are in a constant state of flux. We have to be as well, or we stagnate. And that means an acceptance of our current situation, whether that's about another person, whether it's about a version of ourselves, what we can and cannot do, and accepting public and private, digital and real, various other ways of thinking about what our selfhood is, and stop agonizing about trying to control all that stuff and move beyond it. And as I said, there's something slightly Zen about that acceptance, about not expending energy on things that you can't finally control. So that's what I think. And again, the very fact that this is so hard to unpack is why all BABYMETAL songs are hard to unpack. And when you're somebody like me, when you're also working with the songs in Japanese, then the difficulty gets exponentially more tricky. And I think that's why these things are both evocative and baffling, that there's an amorphous quality to them that invites you to make what sense of them you will. So if this all sounds completely crazy to you and, overly analytical, that's fine, whatever. Do with them what you wish. I think that's kind of the point. Okay, that's all I'm going to say. All right, so if you haven't done so already, please like, comment, subscribe, check out my Patreon page. Thank you to all my patrons. Check out my merchandise, check out my books, particularly, of course, my newest novel, Hideki Smith, Demon Queller. That's all. I will talk to you soon. Thanks.